Welcome to Second Saturday Conversation. This is a place and a time when we talk about Christianity in and for the 21st century. Our overarching prompt or theme for this year is telling the story again anew. Telling the Christian story again anew. And we have suggested all kinds of subtitles for this. Tell them about the dream, call and response, hoping, sighing, dreaming, praying, weeping, seeking. It's a little riff on Derrida. And today, I suggest that the subtitle for telling the story again anew would be listening for the unconditional. By the way, my interest in all of this is not to come up with a new story. And there are people who feel that the Christian story just no longer really speaks to them. But my interest is in liberating us from conventional suppositions and interpretations of the Christian story. Okay. The story is a story. It's a story. So how we interpret the story is really key. Okay. The story is a story. And Marcus might say it's history remembered, history metaphorized, but the language of Scripture is really more symbolic than it is, than I think it is really historical, all right? But it's history remembered, history metaphorized, and then a kind of language that tries to talk about what is giving rise to these stories in the first place. We've inherited presuppositions about what the Christian story is about, either through the teachings of the church or through people's understanding of the biblical stories. I mean, things like Jesus died for our sins so that we can be bridged back to a relationship with God and know that we can go to heaven. That's a long-standing sort of presupposition about what the Christian story is about, that Jesus was a substitutionary atonement for our sinfulness. Well, I for one, do not think that that is a good interpretation of the Christian story. I think also people assume that, still think about God as a being, a supernatural being that holds all of the promises and the punishments and the rewards, okay? And that the New Testament kind of tells us how it's all going to turn out. I don't think that's right either. And I think some of us assume that the New Testament is kind of a manual for the good life. I mean, it might be about Emmanuel, God with us, but it's not a manual. Okay, so these are some inherited presuppositions that I think we have in our thoughts and in the culture about what we think the Christian story is. My interest and encouragement for us is that to come to this story with some more informed presuppositions. Okay, more informed presuppositions, so that we can tell the story again anew with a different and provide a different level of interpretation. Any good story begs for interpretation, and then hopefully hear the Christian story from a slightly different angle, and maybe it'll open up for us and have something to say to us, even in our time, that resonates with what it is to be a human being in the presence of awe and wonder and mortality. So telling the story again anew, that's our overarching prompt for this year. Megan, why don't you orient us a little bit to the technology?
Good
Are you
morning.
there? There she is.
Good morning, everyone. Just a reminder to please keep yourselves muted throughout the morning unless you're called upon. If you do have questions or comments during the conversation, please direct them to the chat. And we want to use the chat space as a place for your comments related to the topic for the day. We'll draw from that chat space for our plenary session later this morning. And if you want to be called upon, you can also indicate that in the chat. Before the plenary, we will give you a few minutes to write in the chat space. We will, as stated, have a plenary at the end of the presentation where Jeff Cresswell and myself will be our moderators this morning. This will be a time to reflect on the thoughts and ideas shared by Marianne. If you would like to personally connect with Marianne, we're offering a coffee time from 11:05 to 11:20 and after the presentation and plenary. Again, if you have any questions during the conversation, please direct them to the chat. Please keep yourselves muted unless called upon. Jeff Cresswell and myself will be monitoring that chat section. And during the plenary, Jeff will call on you to ask your question or share your thoughts, at which time you can unmute yourself. Thank you so much for your time and space, and enjoy the morning.
Thanks, Megan. Megan is the one that sort of gets me hooked in properly to all of this too. So I need her and couldn't be here without her. So Megan, thank you so much for your presence and your time with me. Today, I want to talk about, review a little bit from our last session. Last session, we had a guest, Jack Caputo, and he talked about prayer and the unconditional, okay? So I want to play a little bit with how I understood him talking about prayer and the unconditional. And I'm really interested to know what you make of these two things playing together. And then I'm also, as part of the presentation this morning, I'm also going to make a pivot and make some comments about a gospel text in Matthew, right? So let me frame what I'm going to explore today about prayer and the unconditional by suggesting that we all live in the tension of what might be and what is, of the way things are and the way that we hope they can be. Okay. We live in the tension, and now I'll use this language, between the conditional and the unconditional. Okay. By conditional, I'm going to define it this way, and I think it's really consistent with Jack's understanding, to think of the conditional as operating kind of like an economy. I mean, it's sort of a cause effect, it's reward, punishment, it's sort of quid pro quo. The conditional is very transactional. And I think that's actually how we consider the norm of how we live our lives, okay? That basically our lives are transactional in the way we go about them. The unconditional, okay, now again, I'm suggesting that we live in the tension between the conditional and the unconditional. The unconditional, let me define it this way. And it's a quote that I've used before here on Second Saturdays. It's from Angela Silesius, whose actually real name was Johann Scheffler, but he used this other name as his sort of pen name. I'm going to define the unconditional this way. The rose is without why. It blooms simply because it blooms. It pays no attention to itself, nor does it ask whether anyone sees it. I suggest that is a kind of definition for the unconditional. It is an affirmation of life without expectation of a response or reward. The unconditional is an affirmation of life. It is a gift without a why. Okay. Now, that language may puzzle us, but I'd love you to play with it a little bit. So, as I said, my framing of talking about prayer and the unconditional, drawing on our last session, is based on an understanding that we live in the tension between a transactional sort of economy way of understanding world and recognition that world is also permeated and gets penetrated by the unconditional, which is an affirmation of life without any expectation. Okay. We love life because we love life. Okay. Let me say that Jack suggests that prayer is a response to our awareness of the unconditional. Okay. So he really, if I'm hearing him correctly, puts these two together. And I'm doing that. So this is causing me to sort of think afresh about a lot of this stuff. He says that prayer is that quiet awareness that there is something rather than nothing. That we are in the presence of something. We don't know what it is, but we are in a sort of quiet, wondrous awareness, and we're a part of it. And that this mystery and mortality that we live in actually evokes a sense of compassion for all of those who are part of this mystery and mortality. Okay. And Jack suggests that this awareness, prayer and the unconditional, lays claim to us. Okay. That it has a way of laying claim to us. And he says that this awareness is built into who we are, that it is a deep structure of our human experience, of our human identity, and that prayer is a kind of expression of this deep awareness and response to the fact that we may walk sightless among miracles, but that we are in the midst of something we know not what, but it is remarkable that we are, if you will, that we are here at all. Jack shared that when he was a LaSalle brother, part of the Christian Brothers, that they started every hour with a prayer. Let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God. And for our purposes today, I want to just shift that language very slightly and say, let's think about, let us remember that we are in the holy presence of the unconditional. I mean, I think the word God is problematic for us. We still think, I think, in terms of a God of supernatural theism, even though we're trying to sort of move away from that. The word unconditional is awkward for us too, I think, because many of us maybe have had we think we've had limited experience of the unconditional. And I think it's because we put it in a transactional framework. Okay. But the prayer that Jack started every hour and that the brother started with every hour was, let us remember that we are in the holy presence of the unconditional. That is an explicit prayer. And he said, then you go about the rest of your hour or day living that, having that awareness implicitly. So he suggests that there's explicit prayer and implicit prayer, which means we, on some level, carry that awareness that we are in the midst of something we know not what. We didn't create it. We've arrived in it. And that recognition has a kind of hold on us. It captures us in a way. So, Jack also, and I loved this, talked about more explicit prayer, confessional prayer, petitionary prayer, propositional prayer. And he said, I don't make a mockery of any of that. He said, those prayers are effective, they're useful. That kind of expression, the explicit expressions it's part of our humanity. It's part of what we do. It's part of how we respond. And we can't help but make them personal, address this personally, because it is so personal. But so we use personal pronouns all the time in our prayer. But he says, let us though remember that we are personifying it. And it's understandable that we do, because this is such there's a lot of intimacy in what gets evoked in this awareness. Okay. So explicit prayer is important. It's an expression of this deep structure of awareness in our lives. And this awareness implicitly is there in all that we do. Okay. So just, I'm really curious to know how this language is affecting you. Jack says something else that also really caught me. He suggests that prayer, the unconditional, this awareness, that it seeks us before we can name it. It seeks us before we seek it. Okay. It's an experiential phenomenon. So this is not about believing something. Okay. It's about experiencing something. And that we are responding to the unconditional. And the unconditional is already there. So the unconditional is present. We respond to that affirmation. In a sense, that affirmation of life calls to us before we even know how to name it. And that response to the unconditional is a deep structure and capacity that we have, okay? Which I think is to say we all get this. We all get it. And I'm curious if you agree with that. If my hunch is that you all get that. So let me take a minute to use a different set of images to talk about prayer and the unconditional. And so let me suggest to your imaginal mind that the unconditional, that an awareness, that we walk sightless among miracles, okay, that it comes to us like a still small voice. Or, as the Hebrew Bible describes it, the sound of thinnest silence. The sound of thinnest silence. Now that's theopoetic language. That's not theologic. But that language sort of gets at what are we responding to? We're responding to the sound of thinnest silence. It's something that does address us. And we respond. Actually, we can choose not to, by the way. We can choose not to. We can turn away. Okay. But the unconditional comes to us like a call. And it beckons us, and it summons us. And it is not a call that is about transactions. It's a call that is transformational. It's a transformational claim on us. And we respond to it the way a rose responds to itself. It, if you will, it blooms. The unconditional, okay, this affirmation of life that we recognize, okay, it evokes in us a kind of hope and a sense of possibilities that are beyond what maybe we know now, beyond even what we can imagine. It's like, from West Side Story, something's coming. I don't know what it is, but it is. It's going to be great. Okay, that's the hope. Okay. The unconditional is what impels us to dream and to love. And as Hopkins says, to wish day come. That sense of the unconditional is what makes us dream of even the impossible which can become possible. So again, I'm kind of playing with this language, and I'm really curious to know what it's evoking in you and if it resonates at all. Okay, so let me put the unconditional in one more frame, and this might actually be the most helpful. And that's my little beloved four-legged. He's picking up on something. So let me quote from Kermit the Frog. Now, Jack was our guest last time, but Kermit made an appearance at our last session as well. And he sings this. And again, I'm suggesting that this also has something to do with the unconditional and with this image that I'm suggesting about a voice. Okay, he sings, "Have you been half asleep? And have you heard voices? I've heard them calling my name. Is this the sweet sound that calls the young sailors?" I love the thought that maybe we're all young sailors, or were at one point. Is this the sweet sound that calls the young sailors? The voice might be one and the same. I've heard it so many times. I can't ignore it. It's something that I'm supposed to be. And then he goes on to say, someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. I suggest that the rainbow connection is the unconditional. Have you heard it? Remember that we are in the holy presence of the unconditional. So let me just pause for a minute and actually give you a moment to jot down sort of what questions or thoughts or what's evoking in you from the way I'm using language and talking about prayer and the unconditional. Okay. And actually God. Okay. I think the unconditional is a worthy name for God. And what I think is so important about the notion of the unconditional is that it pops us out of a transactional understanding. And I think, unfortunately, we have God sort of all hooked into some transactional reality that we are going to have to face. Okay. Now, I'm not discounting the importance of transaction. Remember, we live in the tension between the conditional and the unconditional. Okay. So we need the conditional. In fact, the unconditional doesn't exist without the conditional. Now, that may sound like a puzzle, but the unconditional in itself doesn't exist without the conditional. Okay. But I'm just intrigued with these ideas. It's sort of opening me up in a slightly different way. So let me give you a moment to maybe make a jot down something, even in the chat, that we might turn to during the plenary as to how you're hearing what I'm trying to explore. So I'll just give you just a minute. Okay, I'm going to do a little pivot now. And I'm going to read a passage from the Gospel of Matthew. And the reason that I am choosing this passage, and by the way, I'm indebted to Jack Caputo for so many things. You know, Jack said last time that some of his best lines come from Derrida. Well, some of my best thoughts come from Marcus Borg and Jack Caputo. and Jack does a wonderful thing with this text. And I'm sort of going to borrow from that in light of the struggle, the tension between the conditional and the unconditional. Okay, so I think this text is a perfect example of how we are caught in it. And let me give you a spoiler alert about the text. It appears that the transactional wins or is dominant. Let me put it that way. Okay, so I'm going to read a passage from the Gospel of Matthew, and let me tell you a little bit about it. The translation is called the Scholars Version, and it is a translation that the scholars who were part of the Jesus Seminar, it's their translation of this passage. You know, there's the King James, there's the New Revised Standard Edition, there's the American, there are a lot of translations. So this is theirs. They think that it sort of catches the attitude of the text. And I also want you to know that this text is not a story that was told by Jesus. Okay. This is a Matthew story. It's a story from Matthew. It's a Matthew construction. And so in the red letter Bible, this would not come out red. Okay. This is not a story Jesus told. This is Matthew's vision of what the judgment day and the second coming will involve. Okay. And Matthew, written some, 50 years after Jesus' execution, the Matthean community was still expecting a second coming. And Matthew still figured that the presence of a second coming was going to be like a king. Okay. When we were in Advent, we talked so much about how much of the imagery of Advent and the Advent hymns and so forth are about the coming of the king. Okay. So Matthew is this is very common, and this was a very familiar way of thinking about the coming of the Lord, that he would come as a king. So, so here we go. This is from Matthew 25. The king will place the sheep to his right and the goats to his left. And then the king will say to those at his right. Okay. So this is, the separation of the sheep and goats. Some of you who may be familiar with this that'll ring a bell. So it goes on to say, you may remember, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a foreigner and you showed me hospitality. I was naked and you clothed me. I was ill and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to see me. And then the virtuous will say to him, but Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we notice that you were a foreigner and expend hospitality to you, or naked and clothe you? When did we find you ill or in prison and come to visit you? Okay. So let me pause for a minute and say that what has taken place here is that the hungry, the thirsty, the foreigner, the naked, the imprisoned were attended to. And not because they thought it was the Lord, or the way we might put it, not because we think that it was Jesus that we were really attending to, the Christ within the other, which is fine, okay? But why do you feed the hungry? Because they're hungry. Why do you give something to drink to the thirsty? Because they're thirsty. Why do you show the foreigner hospitality? Because he's not like us. He's a human being. And the naked to be clothed? Okay. Why do we do these things? In a sense, let me suggest that the real impulse to care for one another and love one another is like the rose that blooms. In a sense, we do it without a why. We do it not for the reward that we're going to get. We do it because we do it. The rose is without a why. It blooms because it blooms and doesn't ask if it's been seen or if anybody has noticed. Okay. So the first part of this text, I suggest, talks about that sort of unconditional response of care that we give to one another because it's deeply built into us. It is who we are. So, and then, then Matthew goes on to say, and the king will respond to them and say, I swear to you, whatever you did to the most inconspicuous members of my family, other translations say to the least of these, right? To the most inconspicuous members of my family, you did it for me as well. So look what Matthew did. He just turned that into a little bit more of a transactional action. You did that, maybe without a why, but let me tell you, you're going to get a reward for it. This is so common of how we see things then and now. Next, he will say to those at his left, you, which is, left me, some people think that's the sinister side, left side. You condemned to the everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and the messengers. Get away from me, you on the left. Those are the goats. You too may remember I was hungry and you didn't give me anything to drink. I was thirsty and you refused to give me drink. Refused to give me drink. I was a foreigner and you failed to extend hospitality to me. Naked and you didn't clothe me. Ill and in prison and you didn't visit me. And then they will give him a similar reply. Lord, when did we notice that you were hungry or thirsty or a foreigner or naked or weak or in prison and not attempt to help you? So here's a case where we didn't see the Lord in any of those people and we didn't do anything about it. So what's the problem? Okay. He will then respond, I swear to you, whatever you did for the most inconspicuous members of my family, you did it to me. And the second group will then head for everlasting punishment because you didn't care. You didn't do it for me, but the virtuous will have everlasting life. So think about this. The virtuous, what I would like to suggest, who initially were moved by the unconditional, they're going to get everlasting life for that. Okay. Is that the framework that we really think in terms of? I think we tend to, and we tend to think that's the Christian framework. Yeah? And for those who didn't, then they're going to get a punishment. And what's also really stunning about this is that, it's eternal punishment. Eternal punishment, which is really kind of a horrifying thought. I mean, I think everlasting life is a little bit creepy myself, but eternal punishment, I mean, there's no relief even from death, by death. Eternal punishment is a really horrible, horrible idea. So I think this gospel story invites us to play with it and interpret it. What is it really saying to us? What is it really getting us to think about in terms of how we treat one another and why? Okay. Let me tell you a little story about myself that sort of brings this text home to me in a way that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Okay. I did a year of clinical pastoral education. I was part of my formation in preparing to become a priest. And I did a year of work in an acute care hospital in Tacoma, Washington. And my main duties were in the oncology unit. So there was a woman that I had been visiting who had a brain tumor. And then things got worse and she was given, I mean, it was probably some kind of steroids or prednisone or something. Anyway, she ended up unable to speak. She was becoming sort of unrecognizable from the first time I met her. And she was just, it seemed like she wasn't herself. But I continued to see her. And part of the work of this clinical pastoral education is that you would write up a verbatim, I said, she said, or whatever, and then have your colleagues, your peers, and your supervisor help you to hear what you said or help you think through your thoughts about your experience. Okay. So I wrote up a verbatim about visiting this woman. And I said, and the Lord put a love in my heart for her. And I was sincere about that. The Lord put a love in my heart for her. And my supervisor said, what if he hadn't? What would you have done? I was just completely taken aback by that. It's like, I mean, I thought the fact that the Lord put a love in my heart for her, and I was seeing her, that was a good thing, But when he said, what if the Lord hadn't? I didn't get it, by the way. It took me a long time to process this, to figure out what's he getting at. In some ways, it was my first exposure to godless morality. Why do we do what we do? Is it to please God, whatever we think God is? Is it part of a transactional thing, even if it's a good thing, we're doing something we think is caring? But what's behind all that? So my own experience, I had a little bit of the Matthew 25 experience of, no, the Lord put a love in. I loved her because I saw, in a sense, God in her. Okay, but I needed to unpack that. And was that attached to some belief system or whatever, or do we just love one another because we love one another? And is that experience of the unconditional, is that really more an encounter with what we might call God? Is that kind of encounter worthy of that word symbol God. And it's really not about transaction. But I think most of our lives are, we come in with a presupposition that the world functions transactionally. It does. But there's also something else. And I think that that something else, that in-between place that we live, that something else is where our hope and where our hope for the future really lies. So I love that explicit prayer. Let us remember that we are in the holy presence of the unconditional. And how does that affect how we live and move and have our being? So let me give us a moment to just sit with this. And in fact, I will ring the bell for this. Let's just sit with all of this stuff. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are, what your reflections are, how you're taking to my take of how I'm hearing Jack, how this resonates with your own experience. Is this helpful at all? Does it give us a slightly different angle on maybe how we are to look at even our own Christian story, which is a story of living in the tension between, if you will, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Caesar, between the transactional and the unconditional. So I'm going to give you a minute to just sit with this. And then I'll read the listening guidelines and we'll go into plenary session. Okay. I'm just checking something here. Sorry. Okay. Our listening guidelines. Those who have been with us regularly on second Saturdays are familiar with them. They're hard to keep, but I think they're a really helpful and important kind of discipline and mindset to be in as we share and listen to one another. Take time to become settled in God's presence. Listen to others while with your entire self, senses, feelings, intuition, imagination, rational faculties. Do not interrupt. Pause between speakers to absorb what has been said. Do not formulate what you want to say while someone else is speaking. Speak for yourself only, expressing your own thoughts and feelings, referring to your own experiences. Avoid being hypothetical. Steer away from broad generalizations. Do not challenge what others say. listen to the group as a whole, to those who have not spoken aloud, as well as to those who have. Generally leave space for another one, for anyone who may want to speak a first time before speaking a second time yourself. And hold your desires and opinions, even your convictions, lightly. Okay. So we have plenty of time for conversation today. My dear friends, Jeff and Carol, are you there?
We're there.
Okay. I would love for you to help out a bit in terms of helping to identify some things that the group might explore. And by the way, I welcome Jeff and Carol, your own kind of response, take on my riff and my effort to either try to integrate or language what I'm learning from Jack and from my own experience and how to articulate it. So help us out here during plenary time. Good morning, Carol.
Well, one thing that came to my mind, Marianne, when you gave the quote about the rose, I have to say that it reminded me of one of my mentors, Billy Wigglesword, popularly known as William Shakespeare.
Yes, Wigglesword. I did not know that.
Yes, Billy Wigglesword. Anyway, he said, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, which I think is an even more succinct way of saying the very same thing.
Okay.
And I thought it would be nice to hear from Sheila Richards, who I thought brought a great little bit of good humor into the conversation. Sheila, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I live in South Dakota, and to say we are a conservative state in many ways, especially with religion. I mean, everything is pretty black and white and set in stone. And honestly, I have friends who believe that, as I pointed out, God is sitting at some mainframe in the sky, of course, and going like this and punching buttons and reading those old cards that we used to have to make and determining every single thing. And I mean every single thing that you are going to say or do today. I'm a lover of circumstance. And this week, a study that I'm leading, and then I read something over here from some, and they went like this. I said, isn't that great? You know, to be, oh, God did that. Even God did that. That's honestly how people, too many people operate. And one of my other favorite sayings, because they believe God did this and God did that. First of all, I remember when Arthur Ashe was being, a long time ago, a black tennis player, being interviewed. I saw the interview where the person said, aren't you mad at God for giving you AIDS? And he said, why in the world would do that? Nor am I glad at God when I win in Wimbledon. I won Wimbledon. God didn't, you know, so that began my journey of thinking about what God does and does not do. And I also remind people often that God doesn't do anything on purpose, but we can find purpose in the things that happen to us. And many of us are blessed or maybe cursed that it is through our belief in the holy, the unconditional, the sacred that helps us do that. So that's probably enough for me. Thank you.
No, that's great. And I think that many of us still are sort of that framework that you described is so ubiquitous. You know, it's almost built into our culture that this is how you think about God in those kinds of terms. So I think we've been pretty stuck in that, right?
Yes. And I would point out too about Marcus, having heard him one of the first times, he is from North Dakota.
He is from North Dakota.
And so He's one of us.
Come out of North Dakota.
Exactly. And his description of God, growing up in North Dakota, which is not unlike other places, but is exactly this, that God would be at a mainframe, that God sat on a throne with a long white beard, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not easy to remove our first images.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. He grew up in Park River, Park River, North Dakota. And I remember Marcus telling me that, and he was, he was raised Lutheran and from a good Lutheran family, Augustana Lutherans. And he reached a point where he began to rethink all of this stuff, and it was pretty early. And actually, I think it was combined with adolescence. It's like, my God, can God really see everything I'm doing and thinking? But I remember he said to me that prayer, I believe, but help my unbelief. Because the unbelief was, some of this stuff is unbelievable. But I believe, and I would suggest that Marcus, and like most of us, had a sense of what William James might call the more. That sense of the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, which is what Rudolf Aldo calls it. This sense that there's something going on here that we know not what. But so Marcus had that sense, but he was also taught to believe what all that stuff was about. And he just reached a point where he couldn't. And I agree with you that I'm blessed that I was not brought up in the church. So I did not have as much unlearning to do as many do who are involved in the church. But I think when that gets really imprinted, it's very, very hard to free yourself from it. How do we liberate ourselves from that and not be afraid that somehow we're turning away from God? So I'm glad you teach. I'm glad you give classes. I'm glad you invite people to wonder.
Thank you.
And create a safe space for it.
Yes.
Because that's very important. And I can tell already that is what you do.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you. Robert Aubrey had a comment about petitional prayer. Robert, are you there?
Yes, sorry for the delay.
No, that's fine.
It struck me, and I've dealt with this for some time in trying to rationalize prayer in my own brain. I'm a retired commission minister who currently lives in New Hampshire, but was from New Mexico. That being said, I just think that there's this kind of, as I stated in my chat, that there's this underlying denial of the unconditional holy presence in petitionary prayer. And today, or yesterday, I would have put it in terms of God is present and also concerned about my well-being, our well-being. And so then to ask God to be present and concerned for our well-being seems to deny that presence. So that's where my comment was out of.
Right. That's a great insight, I think. As though we have to call on God and let him know, as it were, are you there to care for me? Or hello, do you see me?
Is anybody listening? Yeah,
That's right.
That's perfect. Is anybody listening?
That's right. That's the thing.
So does that notion of let us remember that we are in the presence of, does that kind of prayer make sense to you, Robert?
I think it's the only way for me to take the next step in any of this. And I really beginning to enjoy your theopoetic versus theologic approach to a lot of this. I did have a thought that a rose exists and doesn't need a why, I think is, if I heard it correctly. I think that's a little tougher, I think, for sentient beings. I'm not trying to say roses aren't sentient, but I think it's tougher for us to live without a why or be without without a why.
I agree. I think that's a very, very wise and helpful comment. And that is also part of the human condition, isn't it? It is really hard for us to live without a why.
Right.
And yet, if Jack is right, and I think he is, we have a deep structure in us that can.
Mm.
And maybe
Hard as that is to believe.
as hard as that is to believe.
both.
Perfect. And
And for
that
both.
maybe we even have
Yeah.
a longing
We
a
do.
longing to bloom without a why. Okay.
Mm.
And the I don't want to now sound like I'm doing a Matthew here and turning it into a transaction, but I think that the blooming without a why, it's not without its beauty and effect, and it is part of life affirmation. So it's not that it's nothing.
No, that's right.
That's
I
right.
think we're made more whole if we are
That's right.
acting out of the care for other,
That's right.
and made more broken when we don't. And so
That's right.
there's something to be gained or lost,
That's right.
depending on how we act and receive the world around us.
I agree. And I think that I love how you've put it, that there's something that's more whole, it's more healing for us and for the world.
Mhm.
And I think that really is where our hope is for
I hope so.
You
me too,
You
me
bet,
too,
lady.
for our future. Because I think the stakes are that high, that if we don't
Right.
move more towards this, if you will, unconditional awareness, which Jack insists is deep in our structure, to be aware of that, okay? So it's not something we have to believe, it's something that we need to experience. And I don't have the language for it, but
Practice. We have to practice it.
practice. You
And
know,
it starts with that prayer. Remind me again, I'm in the unconditional holy presence.
That's right.
right.
Now moving into what comes next.
That's right.
Exactly. Moving into what comes next, and we don't know.
That's right.
And the unconditional is not an idealization.
Mm-mm.
So it's not that.
That would be a condition.
Exactly right. Thank you. You got it.
Thank you
helping.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're helping me to clear my thinking about this. It would make it conditional. Anyway, thank you very much for this, Robert.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Very interesting and personal comment from Linda Larson. Linda, would you like to share your story?
Yes, I would. So I made a comment about my mother. I'll just read what I said. I said, as Alzheimer's took my mother's brain, she no longer judged me and condemned me to hell for being a lesbian. The only connections we had at that point were heart connections. I called them that and discovered in them the unconditional.
Okay.
But I didn't call it that. But I am grateful for you giving us that full concept of God and the experiences we can have in relationship with each other. So that time period was 1980 when I came out to my parents, and my mother died in 2012. So her struggle and sadness, and every time I come in the room, was to cry because I was going to hell. So that's 1980, 2000, 1980 to 2011. That's a lot of years. And another experience of the same context, when we grew up, we were told that Black people were scary and we were to stay away from them. So when she went into the care center, there was two Somalia men that were aids for her that she was afraid of until about that same time, Alzheimer's also took her judgment of color. So I went into the cottage, into her space, and she was being held by this very large, such a heart-giving man in his arms, and she came about to his chest, and he was rocking with her back and forth. And I thought, and that's when it struck me that Alzheimer's took that judgment away. So that was only heart connections. There wasn't anything you could even rationalize about what that experiences was, just like same with me, that she didn't cry when I came in the room anymore. There's not an explanation for that. So you gave us an explanation today, and I appreciate that.
Well, I'm really moved by that story. And when I think of the 30 years that she worried about you because of her belief system, I mean, in a sense, it robbed her of her being able to love you in the way that she really did.
Mhm.
I think so.
You know? And it robbed you of that. And thank goodness you were able to move through that and blossom the way you blossom, you know. But I think when we are touched by that, it's transformational.
It is. It is. And it made me realize the importance of that to all other people, of, you know, that you feed people because they're hungry, not because there's anything in it, but it's a heart connection that said, I care for you and I want to make sure you're fed.
Exactly.
Mm.
And I think that we recognize that we know when we've been cared for that way.
Yes.
Condition.
Yep. I called it with my mother and other people, when you're talking to other people and they light up. And I think that's a familiar concept, when you can see that connection, that people light up. And I love the times when my mother would light up. And
Sweet.
it was always about that heart connection.
Mm.
And I think this unconditional is the same. People light up.
Lit from within.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
Oh my. Linda, thank you.
Yeah.
That's a
Thanks
very,
for letting me share that.
well, it's so I mean, I'm really glad that you and your mother experienced a kind of beauty and intimacy before she died.
Me too.
We don't know, not all of us get that.
Yep.
In that way.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you did.
Mm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Linda. Appreciate
Yeah.
it. Stephen Braun has a hand raised. Stephen, do you want to make a comment or ask a question?
Sure. I'm having one of those unity moments where everything seems to be coming together, and my whole life and everything I think I've learned, it seems reflected in today's topic. I'll give you a couple of examples. Took a graduate seminar on existentialism when I was in my 20s. Sartre talked about being in itself and for itself. And to me, that's an echo of the transactional and the unconditional. Zen, I did a long time of studying Eastern civilizations and Eastern philosophies and practices. You can't be in Zen by thinking your way into it. It's a happening event. And if you're fortunate enough to be in that moment, it affects you and you can perhaps be influenced by it, but you can't hold on to it or will yourself into it, okay? So again, it's like the unconditional. There was, I think it was from Marcus, there was somewhere I read that which is true for all people everywhere and at all times. That's some sort of rule of theology. It cuts through all the doctrinaire stuff that's conditioned. So I'm hearing the language we're using against other kinds of philosophies or faith traditions, and it all seems to be the same thing, this unity of opposites coming together experientially for that brief moment, but that experience of the unconditioned can be called enlightenment, Zen, God, whatever you want to call it. But I just had to say, everything you're talking about just keeps bringing up all these other examples in my mind from my life. And thanks for the opportunity.
Well, I love what you're saying, because in a sense, it's a testimony to the fact that this is built deeply in us. And you are a case in point, right? It's deeply built into you. And in some ways, it sounds like you have been searching a way to sort of release that, or let that be, or I don't know what the language, you'd have better language than I for this, but it's something that you recognize. And I agree with you. Sometimes these moments don't last very long. They are incomprehensible. You can't put your hands or mind around it, but that doesn't mean that they aren't real. And sometimes I think these moments are more real than a lot of other things we say is real. Does that make any sense to you, Steve?
Absolutely.
Does it? Okay.
Yes, some indelible moments. If you have these kinds of experiences, Maslow would have called peak experiences or religious experiences, they don't go away. I remember things that happened when I was very young, all through my life. I've been blessed to have had several. And as you say, they're ineffable. It's really difficult to try to use words to tell other people about them. One of my mantras is words are stones, thoughts are flowers. And sometimes it's to remind me that words, as much as I love them, don't do the trick.
Yeah, that's why I love that quote of Angelus Silesius, because somehow what he is expressing in words about the rose, it communicates more to me than a lot of words that are expressed about what the rose can express for us. I think you and I are on the same page there. So, yeah. And I also love what you're saying, that when you've had these experiences, they don't go away. Okay. I think the experience stays with you. The moment may, nothing is fixed, but there is something about those experiences that, if you will, stay with us. So, and I think this is part of the awe and wonder of what it is to be a human being. And I'm glad we haven't missed it. Yeah. And I hope there's a future for future generations to have it. Anyway, Steve, thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something, but I don't have a waving hand.
I know this voice. This is Lily Stallberg, a good friend of mine.
Yes.
And hello, Lily.
Hi, Marianne. I wanted to say that as long as people do not hear things like you are inviting us to ponder about today, they do stay in the belief system. And by the grace of God, they can have here and there such an ineffable experience. But most of the time, we also need to practice to read and to open our minds to be trained into new ways of thinking. It does come sometimes, such experiences come and surprise us. But for the majority of people, we need the practice and we need to hear such things that you are telling us today. If we don't hear new things, how can we change our minds? And most people go to churches where they hear the black and white, like the woman from South Dakota said. And no, it is true. And when they hear things like you are saying, like, it's so mind-boggling. And we need to as pastors need to open this up so people can hear new things and create new ideas in their new thoughts. Without practicing this, it's hard. It's a hard teaching, although it's easy. I mean, if we opened up, we would have these experiences come to us, but we are so stuck in the belief system that nothing breaks through that shell.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a concern of mine that, as I said in the beginning, was that we have some presuppositions about what we think the religious life or the Christian life in particular is about, right?
Right.
That actually, to use this as an image, it's almost like Lazarus, that we are bound with all the wrappings of our beliefs and our teachings, as though that's it. And some of us are finding that we are in a tomb and we're not dead yet.
Correct.
So it's like pull us out and unbind us.
Unbind us.
We can live our life anew. Okay. So I think some of it is teaching, but I also think that some of it is just being, if you're attentive to this in your own experience, this sort of these moments of wonder. And I do think that grace happens all the time.
Yes.
I think these moments when we are, something penetrates through even all of our resistance and unbelief and teachings and rigidity, stuff breaks through. I think grace happens, okay?
Great.
And that it's not because we practiced or because we got it, it gets us. And something breaks through and then it claims us, it gets us. If we can encourage one another, if we get more curious about sharing that with one another, I think that will help to make a difference.
I fully agree.
I'm with Jack that my great hope, my conviction is, and I know we're supposed to hold our convictions lightly, but that we as human beings, that this is built into us, that our capacity for awe and wonder is. And yet we do indeed struggle with it. And because of that mysterium tremendum, that fascinans, it's also terrifying. We go through all kinds of ways to try to protect.
That is the thing, when fear is what binds us, like Lazarus. It's fear of hearing something new.
Right. And this is part of the human condition. Okay. But and so this is part of our loving work together to help us to not be quite so fearful about that which we have no control over, quite frankly. But we are part of something. And isn't it something? As they say in North Dakota, it's really something. That was one of the deepest compliments my beloved Marcus ever gave to me, when I overheard him say to somebody else, "She's really something." So I had to translate, I had to interpret that in a way that, but anyway, thank you, Lily. And I know you're a heart concern for this kind of work, and your heart concern that we be more liberated in our lives together, and more grateful, frankly, less afraid and more grateful for just
absolutely. And
right.
to open
life affirming.
Jesus did not say to, I remember he said, be opened, not be open, but be opened, which for me means that we open ourselves to allow the Spirit to open us. It's just an inbreaking of the Spirit when we experience that ineffable. And
I think the inbreaking of the Spirit is not about belief.
No, and that's the thing. It's like if we could erase our minds.
Well, don't erase it, but bring better suppositions to it. Or informed suppositions. Okay. Anyway, thank you, Lily, and we'll thank you. I'm glad that you made yourself heard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Mary Oster, you have your hand up.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
In a way, I'm piggybacking on something Stephen said about his unity experiences. I too, Stephen, have had certain peak experiences, I think you called them, from different modalities of meditation, etc. And what attracts me to the Jesus story is the conditional, in the sense that it's set in a political time, and how do you be in relationship with others? So I still try to infuse my day with a form of prayer and meditation because it helps me with balance and helps me not get in the way of my own self, my personality, etc. But that's kind of what really attracts me. So it's not so much even about enlightenment or salvation, because I think in some of those traditions, it's this goal kind of oriented thing, whereas the mystery, great, but what are we going to do with it? And for me, that's what's attracting me to understanding the Jesus story.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's because we live in a difficult time. What's being called forth?
Exactly. And I think that's a great question. What is being called for? What do we really value? What do we really think is possible, and why?
And there's the why. Yeah.
You know, and there indeed, there's the why. And to think that it might be without a why in the way that we're talking about it is, it's almost iconoclastic, isn't it? You know, but yeah, I think there's a hope and a hopefulness that really runs deep in the human imagination and in the human spirit. And especially in these times, oh my, well, let me put it this way, potentially quoting Jesus, do not be afraid, and let not your heart be troubled. Actually, that's from John's Gospel, and most of that doesn't get a read. But I think the Spirit of Jesus would encourage us to not be afraid and affirm life. It's a gift. It's a gift. And we've got to start going about this really, really differently, collectively. Yeah. Anyway.
I don't have a.
Thank you, Mary.
I don't have a hand either. I don't know if I can say something.
Sure. Go ahead, Kathleen.
So yeah, this sort of piggybacks on what Stephen and Mary were saying. And I particularly like what Mary was saying about the conditional and the unconditional. And so much of the gospel is about the conditional, it's how we live our lives. And I maybe because of my interest in natural history and things like that, I have a harder time separating these things out, conditional, unconditional. Every time we start pulling apart the world and we create categories, when it's already part of one thing, then there's I think it builds some falsehoods into it. And that's where I get, this is where I start getting drawn to Buddhism, which doesn't do that. So there's
I think though that we do indeed live in the tension of those two things. I know that there's that duality that I'm setting up.
Well, maybe I'm thinking, if you talk about the conditional in terms of, if I do this, I'm going to get rewarded by God, that kind of, there's that sort of thing. And then there's the transactions in our daily life.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you money for food because I have to eat. And then, but you use that money, there's all kinds of ways we live, and the natural world does it too. Flowers bloom, they do bloom for a reason. And we have to be, I think, and that's not all bad. We have mortal bodies, we have senses, we taste things that are glorious. This is all part of our mortality, and we don't need to demean it. And the transactional things that we do. We're anxious people. Human beings are anxious and fearful. And so I think this is where, we want to be reassured. So I suppose I'm more drawn to Buddhism, which just really, but when I go toward my Buddhist leanings, I think, is it important to study the gospel? What does it mean to be a Christian and have a Christian life in the way that we're talking?
Yeah.
So it would seem to say that, yes, there is something in the gospel, that the Christian life is really not that different from the kind of way we're looking at the world around compassion and stillness, and this larger thing that we're part of is very much like other traditions, as Stephen said. But why do I still think of myself as a Christian or drawing something from the Christian tradition? And what is it? And what would you do if you think that's important to you? If you feel something deeply about these stories about Jesus, maybe you want to shuck all the doctrine. If you were to say to someone who was interested in this, where would you start with them?
Right.
Where would you start with a person who's interested in this spirituality we're talking about?
Mhm.
Because theoretically, you could do it without the Gospels. All the things that we're talking about. They could become a Buddhist, they could do something else, they could have their own sort of spirituality, which feeds, builds and amplifies on all this, and that would be fine. But then I think of the question, so do the Gospels matter, and why?
Yeah, that I really, really appreciate what you're saying. And I think what you're saying is really important. And your awareness about the transactional and sort of being a little bit, relaxing a little bit about making that too tight a category. What I would say about maybe one reason that you are a little bit haunted by the Gospels is maybe that was the tradition that you were born into. It's culturally in this country, it's sort of dominant. I mean, I don't know what people, what people mean by being Christian today.
Yeah, right.
But so some of that might be the accidents of your environment.
Yeah.
But what I would like to think is that it's not that Christianity holds this,
right?
That it reflects it, as does Buddhism, as does Islam, as does Hindu. That we're all. There is, if the unconditional is the unconditional, there's something that we are responding to about the experience of life. Okay. And religion, I think the religious impulse is that deep responding to the fact that there is something rather than nothing. Okay. Yeah. Religions come into play and they take on all the cultural conditions. And so, and I think this is why Jack and others talk about a religionless religion. I love your question. Where would you start with somebody who wants to know about all of this? Would you take them to the Gospels? Well, you know what? I don't know. I still turn to those stories because they continue to speak to me. But some of that is, but it's not because that's the only way that the experience we're talking about is mediated. I can experience that in art. I can experience that in the way the sun falls in the afternoon. I can experience that watching my dog sometimes. Okay. That just, there's some kind of encounter with whatever this is. And if the Gospels can be understood in a way that affirms that, great. I'm still finding that there's life in the Gospels, right? But I'm not saying that the Gospel is the key.
Right.
But it's one of many ways of trying to express the inexpressible.
Right. I think the Gospels appeal a great deal to people still because of human suffering. And I mean, Buddhism talks about suffering too, but Buddhism doesn't quite have the centrality of the Gospels who goes through such immense suffering. And I think that's what people very often get drawn to. And yet at the same time, it's also the crux of our difficulties in terms of, the idea of substitutionary atonement and things like that, which
terrible idea.
So I guess if the Gospels completely disappeared and the whole figure of Jesus just vanished, would I be sad? If it disappeared from culture and time, and what would I want to keep from what is it that appeals to me about that so much? Is it the topsy-turviness of the way Jesus thinks?
I want to say something, Marianne.
So
you know what? I want to just give one more person a chance, Marianne. We're kind of running out of time.
I see that. Yeah.
There's a
I
hand.
love your questions, though. I love your questions. And what is it about the Gospels or Jesus that we would want to take into the future? That's a fair question.
Yes.
And that's why I'm saying, can we tell the story again anew? Is it worth it?
Yeah.
I think it is. Okay. But I love your questions and your thoughts. I love it. Thanks
a lot, Kathleen.
Yeah.
And let's end with Lal Chandranath, whose hand has been up for a while. Lal, can you unmute yourself? Lal, are you there?
Is
Oh,
that
maybe-
working now?
Yes, there you go.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay,
I
great.
did lose him.
So it's a very quick question because I've been fascinated by Marianne's description of the conditional and the unconditional and so on. I have had great difficulty trying to express myself, maybe because I'm no good in English, like, yeah. However, sometimes this strange thought has come upon me. Am I living or am I being lived?
Okay.
The reason I say so is when I take the latter feeling that I'm being lived, I'm able to leave alone my ego, like. And then I can be like the rose, blooming without worrying about why I bloom or whatever I be. I'm just being lived like. I don't know whether it makes any sense or whether it's nonsense, but that's what I felt like.
Well, I'm actually really caught by what you're saying. But let me also say that the way you say it and looking at you while you say it, my assumptions, my presuppositions are that you're rooted in a kind of sense of care and compassion. So if whatever it is lives through us, and I don't want this to sound idealistic, I want this to sound life affirming, true, okay, true, that we seek justice, we love kindness, we'll walk humbly. So if to have whatever you sense living through you, that it moves you in that way. And in a sense, it's not just what we live for, maybe it is also what do we die for. But if that's part of it, then I say, yes, let that live through you. I think a lot of what lives through us is counterfeit. So if what you're speaking to, and my sense is that it has to do with loving kindness and doing justice and walking humbly. And it's like, when you get into that, then that's the call. That's the summons. And it's calling me to be something, as Kermit the Frog says. And I think you've heard that and felt that too many times to turn away from it. So it is living through you. Is that a fair mirroring of what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, I would think so, because since I got that feeling maybe a year and a half ago, I live with much less stress and anxiety because I just go about being lived like.
Maybe you can even enjoy it.
Yes.
Yeah, while all the rest of the world isn't, but you can enjoy it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for hanging in there. I'm glad we were able to get to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Marianne, I just have to tell you that the chat is well beyond my ability to capture even a tenth of what's there. There's been a lot of comments and questions and discussion. You've really hit a nerve with people in a good way, hit a nerve. And I just want to apologize to those of you who had comments and questions that we weren't able to get to. With 200 people on the call, it's really hard to moderate and make sure all the voices get heard. But thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. So I'll turn it over to you, Marianne.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And I will look forward to reading the chat myself. And yeah, and thanks to all of you for helping me to think about this and reflect and share that with me. That's why I show up for Second Saturday. Couple quick things. Our next session will be March 12th. That's Second Saturday. And let me remind you that as a bit of an experiment, we are having this month, we're having a third Saturday. Okay, it'll be next Saturday, the 19th. And we've already sent out an email about this. That is not required. It is not a substitute for Second Saturday. It's because of Second Saturday, but and it's completely optional. And the kicker is, it's going to give you an opportunity to be in small groups, which is not everybody's cup of tea. Okay, but the purpose of the third Saturday is to give people a chance to be in small groups, probably of 5. And you'll be randomly put into small groups. And we have people from all over the place showing up. So that will be interesting, I hope. Of course it will be. And to reflect a little bit on the kinds of stuff we're talking about and how you experience it. People were beautiful, lovely today in sharing a bit about their experiences, which is what I so value, okay? But it'll give you a chance to meet with others in small groups to talk about this stuff, right? And I would actually, if you're at all interested in that, I would do the RSVP for that. It requires an RSVP no later than this coming Wednesday, which is the 15th. And that way we'll know how many people we need to put in groups. And then on Thursday, I'll send out a welcoming email to those who have RSVP'd. We'll do another one of these in May, another third Wednesday in May. And as I said, it's kind of an experiment, and it's a response to some of you who would like to have more face-to-face time with other people who show up for Second Saturday, okay? We will have coffee time today following, so those of you who can make it, I look forward to seeing you. The closing music for today is, I'm going to be playing, it's actually from South Pacific. It's You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. And this is, but it's James Taylor singing it. And one of you mentioned this very thing about being taught early about some things and how hard it is to undo that. So James Taylor says, you've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. You've got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid. And this is sort of awkward language here, but of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is of a different shade. Okay. I think about Linda talking about the man who embraced and rocked her mother. You've got to be carefully taught. And then I love this last phrase, this last one. He says, you've got to be taught before it's too late. So I'm hoping that for none of us, it's not too late for any of us. But he says, you've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. It goes that early that we start picking up our prejudices. Okay, you've got to be carefully taught. I think with Christianity, we have to be retaught, unlearned and relearned and untaught and taught anew or whatever. So that will be our closing music for today. Let me end with a prayer that I think I shared in the coffee time last time, and it was a slide that we saw in the beginning. But I think that this prayer is it's a Jewish Sabbath prayer, and it's a wonderful response to let us remember that we are in the presence of the unconditional. Days pass and the years vanish, and we walk sightless among miracles. Fill our eyes with seeing and our minds with knowing. Let there be moments when your presence, like lightning, illumines the darkness in which we walk. Help us to see wherever we gaze that the bush burns unconsumed. And we, clay touched by God, will reach out for holiness and exclaim in wonder, how filled with awe is this place? Thank you for being with us today. I look forward to seeing you next time.